I am very grateful to your pastor and my friend for the invitation to be here and to share worship with you over the next few weeks. And thank you for your warm welcome. Were someone to ask us, where in the Bible can you learn something about love? Most of us would immediately respond, well, the love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13. However, I would make a case that the fourth chapter of the first epistle of John is filled with references to love, and very importantly, about how we are to allow love rather than fear to drive our attitudes and our actions as followers of Jesus. This morning we heard Kyle read those words beginning at verse 12, where we got in that brief section of Scripture, I believe the word love appears some 16 or 17 times. I love that verse that bridges really two verses that says, love is fulfilled in this world when we are like Jesus. Love is fulfilled in this world when we are like Jesus. Let us think together this morning about how our fears impact and even determine our faith. Now, I'm not talking about some serious phobias or anxieties that need specific treatments, but rather what are those worrisome, often irrational, and ill-informed concerns that make us uncomfortable, that put us on the defensive, and that shape our beliefs and practices in order to accommodate those fears. The writer of John's epistles says it very clearly that perfect love casts out or drives out fears. However, we all know that the inverse is true as well, that fear has the capacity to cast out love. And that's how we end up with these so-called expressions of Christianity without the essential and defining element of love as taught and exemplified by Jesus. Fear causes us to do things out of character with our best selves and out of character with what Jesus has revealed to us. My friend Bill Tillman is a Christian ethicist out in Texas, and he wrote something a few years ago that I found to be particularly profound. Dr. Tillman wrote, "Tell me what you fear, and I will tell you something of what you believe. Tell me what you fear, and I will tell you something of what you believe." It's so true that if we become fearful or threatened by a certain group of people based on race or nationality or religion or any other identifying factor, then we tend to construct our belief system to accommodate our demonizing of those people. Tell me what you fear, and I will tell you something of what you believe, because our fears so often define our faith. At times we see this stark contrast between what some call a Christian worldview or Christian priorities or actions with the very life and teachings of Jesus. And we wonder, how did we end up with these perspectives that are so far apart from what Jesus taught and showed us? And the answer is usually rooted in fear. Now, the writer of 1 John is not the first or the only voice to warn believers of the paralysis and captivity of fear. Now, I'm an editor and a writer. I work with words, not with numbers. But someone else has counted 365 biblical references that call for not being afraid. Does that number ring a bell? 365? There is a fear not biblical message for every day of the year. It must be very important. Jesus himself told his followers repeatedly, fear not. Why? Because in the same way that love casts out fear, our fears can cast out love. Now, we may be tempted to downplay this reality, saying, well, everybody's afraid of something, or it's not a big deal. But it is a big deal because it defines not only our personal faith, but fear defines our practice of faith and how we convey the gospel to others. In the Interpretation Bible commentary on the Epistle of John, the late New Testament scholar D. Moody Smith wrote, when John wants to underscore a point, he sometimes envisions an antagonist who says the opposite or acts falsely, and then brands the one who speaks or acts in that way to be a liar. Now, my mother taught me my whole life not to call someone a liar, but apparently John's mother didn't do that. He writes in 1 John 4:20, suppose someone claims to love God but hates a brother or sister, then they are a liar. They don't love their brother or sister whom they have seen, so they can't love God who they have not seen. Dr. Smith calls this the gripping and graphic denial that Christians can love the invisible God if they don't love their own highly visible brothers and sisters. I'll save you the time. I've checked through the Bible looking for loopholes. There aren't any. I have a high school classmate who is a proud, independent, fundamentalist Baptist preacher. Once he proclaimed on Facebook, I am not, nor have I ever been, interested in a person's heart. I am interested in a person's doctrine. He could not be more wrong. While doctrine has its important place, what matters most is what is in our hearts, because whether we allow fear to drive out love or love to drive out fears defines our beliefs as well as our behaviors. And we simply cannot love the invisible God and hate those whom we consider to be less deserving of God's love and grace. The biblical writer John is very clear. There is no separation between the presence of God's Spirit in our lives and the presence of God-like love for other people. In fact, John uses the word love as the very defining nature of God. In verse 16, he states emphatically, God is love. And he is repeating that affirmation that he made just 8 verses earlier. Often our unhealthy fears are based on emotions rather than rational thinking. So it requires an intentional effort to allow the love of God to cast out those fears. The Baptist Bible scholar Edward McDowell, in his commentary on this passage, wrote very insightfully, such love must be exercised by the will and the mind and cannot depend on expression by emotion or feeling. Does that make sense to us? We read or hear something that creates fear within us, and then we get defensive, and then we construct our belief system to accommodate those fears. And the end result is that fear wins out over love. John writes, "The one who fears does not have perfect or complete love." Dr. McDowell notes that the person who is driven by fear rather than love does not attain maturity. We know that fear paralyzes and inhibits our human efforts. It separates individuals from one another. It creates suspicion, and it can even lead to violence and emotional instability. Yet on the other hand, when love casts out fear, when love motivates individuals to respect and accept one another, it creates an atmosphere of good in which we can live together. Dr. McDowell sums it up like this: love matures individuals while fear impedes our growth toward maturity. If we genuinely want to be faithful, mature followers of Jesus, we must allow love to cast the fear out of our lives, rather than letting our fears suppress our love. I can't overstate how clear and how profound are John's words that love is fulfilled among us when in this world we are like Jesus. For Jesus never let fear reign over love. It was the late John Claypool who I first heard note that not only does love cast out fear, but fear casts out love. He told of traveling to London as a college student and entering a small rural inn. And there on the mantel were carved these words: "Fear knocked at the door, faith answered. There was no one there." I'm not sure where that quote originated, but it's been repeated many times. But it is true that if we allow our beliefs and therefore our behaviors to be shaped by whatever makes us uncomfortable or strikes us as fearful rather than by love, we cannot attain what God desires of us as mature followers of Jesus. Which brings up an important question for all of us. Which is more true? Which is more true for each of us? Is fear keeping us from being more loving? Or is love keeping us from being more fearful? Often our fears are really frustrations that cause us to become defensive, that cause us to be unloving. We cannot escape fears, but we can decide that love will drive them out. Oh, we all have fears, don't we? 5-year-old Billy was in the kitchen while his mother was cooking. She had a pot or a pan on every eye of the stove, so she asked him to go to the pantry and get a can of tomato soup, and he said he was scared. Well, she tried to coax him into doing that since she couldn't step away from the stove. And like many of us parents, when that didn't work, she turned to God for help. She said, "It's okay, Billy. Jesus will be in the pantry with you." He walked over to the pantry and wasn't fully convinced. He cracked the door and it was dark in there, so he didn't move. Finally, she said, "But Billy, Jesus will be in there with you. It's okay." So he cracked the door again and said, "Jesus, if you're in there, will you please hand me a can of tomato soup?" Now that's the expected response of immaturity. It takes courage to face our fears, but it also takes love. For fear flourishes in self-interest, yet love shifts our fears to concern for others, even those unlike us. So this morning I ask that we prayerfully and intentionally allow the love of God to consistently and continually cast the fear out of our lives that keeps us from being as loving and as faithful as God calls us to be. Well, how do we know whether we're doing that or not? How do we know whether fear is pushing love out of our lives or love is pushing fear out of our lives? Well, there really is a simple test. The epistle writer John said it clearly. Love is fulfilled in this world when we are like Jesus. Do we love like Jesus? May our prayer be that each and every day that the love of God pushes the fear out of our lives rather than allowing the fear to cause us to be unloving.